Hello. The small town of Whitford was nestled between rolling hills and vast fields of grain, with its dusty streets winding lazily through clusters of modest houses and old barns. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's name and their business. People worked the land, planted crops, and tended to the herds, and life moved at a pace that could be measured by the seasons, not the clock. For most of the residents, comfort and satisfaction were measured in simple things. A warm meal, a successful harvest, a family gathering. Among these humble folk was a farmer named Thomas O'Reilly. He wasn't rich by any means, at least not in the way most people would define wealth, but he had enough. Enough land to work, enough food to feed his family, and enough peace in his heart to keep him content. His farmhouse, built from the stone and timber that had been in the O'Reilly family for generations, stood at the edge of town. From his porch, Thomas could see the sun rise and set over the fields he'd plowed and sowed since he was a young boy. One cold November morning, as Thomas was finishing his chores and preparing to head into town to buy supplies, he noticed something unusual near the edge of his property. A young man, perhaps in his late teens, was sitting on the old stone wall that separated the O'Reilly farm from the road. His hair was disheveled, his clothes torn, and there was a certain defeated look in his eyes. His face was pale, and it seemed as though he hadn't slept in days. Thomas approached him cautiously, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The boy didn't acknowledge him at first, as though he was lost in his own world of exhaustion and regret. Thomas cleared his throat. "Son, you all right?" he asked in his usual, deep voice. The boy looked up slowly, his eyes bloodshot and dull. "I'm fine," he muttered, though it was clear from his posture that he wasn't. Thomas observed him for a moment longer. The boy was trying to hide something Thomas had seen before in others who had fallen on hard times. He could tell the boy was struggling, but it wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was something deeper, more complicated. He had that look about him, the kind that comes from a night spent in excess and a heart weighed down with burdens too heavy for a young man to bear. "Come on," Thomas said, stepping closer. "You don't look fine to me. You look like you could use a bit of help. What's your name, son?" The boy blinked, as if surprised that anyone was speaking to him, let alone offering assistance. "Jake," he said hoarsely. "Jake Mason. Jake Mason," Thomas repeated. "Well, Jake, you don't look like you're from around here. You need a place to rest? Or maybe a little something to eat?" Jake hesitated, his eyes darting around. It was clear he wasn't used to being offered kindness. I'm all right," he muttered again, though his voice cracked. Thomas didn't press him further, but his instincts told him to be gentle. "I've got a little spare room in my barn. Why don't you come inside, get some water, rest for a bit? You don't have to talk if you don't want to." Jake looked down at the ground, clearly reluctant, but something in Thomas's voice or presence seemed to convince him. With a resigned sigh, he finally nodded. "All right," Jake said. "I could use a break." They walked slowly together to the farmhouse, the quiet stretch of land around them seeming to hold its breath. The morning was chilly, and the mist from the nearby woods still hung in the air like an unseen veil. As they reached the barn, Thomas led Jake to a small corner that was filled with hay and a warm, wood-burning stove. "You can rest here for as long as you need," Thomas said, gesturing to the pile of hay. "I'll make some breakfast, and you're welcome to it. No charge." Jake sat down on the hay, his face sagging with a mixture of relief and wariness. He was clearly unused to this kind of kindness. As Thomas disappeared into the house to prepare something warm, Jake sat in the quiet barn, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. He didn't know why he had come to Whitford, nor why he had ended up on this man's land. He had no plan, no real destination, just a foggy, self-destructive kind of aimlessness. By the time Thomas returned with 2 steaming bowls of oatmeal, Jake had curled up in the hay, his eyes half closed as the warmth of the barn began to seep into his tired bones. "You need to eat," Thomas said gently, holding out a bowl. Jake sat up slowly, still blinking sleep from his eyes. He took the bowl without a word, and for a moment, there was only the sound of spoons against porcelain as they ate in silence. Thomas, ever the patient observer, Let the boy take his time. It was about halfway through their quiet meal when Jake finally spoke. "I'm sorry," he muttered, looking down at the bowl in his hands. I shouldn't be here. I don't want to bother you." Thomas paused and set his spoon down, studying the boy's face. He wasn't quite sure what had led Jake here, but he could see the rawness in him, the vulnerability. He had been in places like that himself long ago. He had lived through his own dark days. "Jake," Thomas said softly, his tone unwavering, "you're not bothering me. I'm just offering a bit of kindness. No one ever gets through life alone. You don't need to be ashamed of needing help." Jake looked up, the weight of those words sinking in. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone had treated him like a human being, not just a problem to be dealt with. "I've made some bad choices," Jake admitted quietly, staring into the steaming bowl of oatmeal. "I'm not proud of them. I've been running." Thomas didn't push him, though he could feel the storm of emotions behind Jake's words. He had seen enough of life to know when to give someone space. "We all have our demons," Thomas said, almost as if to himself. "But you don't have to run anymore. Sometimes all it takes is one step toward something different." Jake didn't respond, but the silence between them felt less heavy now. Thomas finished his meal and stood up, giving the boy a moment of peace. "You don't have to stay here forever," Thomas said with a small smile. "But as long as you do, you're welcome to what I have." And so, the two of them sat in that quiet barn, one man offering what little he had, and the other beginning to feel, for the first time in a long while, that maybe he wasn't as lost as he had thought. Days turned into weeks, and Jake Mason's life slowly began to change in the quiet corners of Thomas O'Reilly's farm. At first, Jake had been a reluctant guest, awkward, distant, and prone to disappearing into the barn for hours at a time. But little by little, the rigid shell around him started to soften. The steady rhythm of farm life, the simplicity of it, seemed to pull him in, like the slow rise of the sun pulling the day from the dark. Thomas didn't ask Jake to do anything. He simply offered him a roof, a warm meal, and a quiet space to think, free from judgment. He had seen how the weight of the world could bend a person, how the smallest acts of kindness could sometimes change the course of a life. And though Jake rarely spoke about his past, Thomas could sense the burden he carried. Each morning, Thomas would get up before the crack of dawn to tend to his animals and prepare the fields for sowing. He worked hard, but there was always a certain serenity in his movements, as if the land itself had given him peace long ago. Jake, for his part, had started to help out, first with small chores like feeding the chickens or collecting eggs. Over time, Thomas showed him how to tend the crops, how to fix broken equipment, how to care for the cattle. Jake didn't think he was capable of any of it at first, but as the weeks wore on, he found himself growing stronger. It wasn't just the work that changed him. It was the slow, steady rhythm of the days, the assurance that he wasn't alone. There was something grounding about it. The dirt beneath his fingernails, the smell of fresh hay and grass, the deep sigh of the wind as it rolled over the land. He had forgotten how good it could feel to simply exist without the constant pressure of expectations, to simply be. One evening, as Jake helped Thomas bring in the last of the hay for the season, he found himself actually smiling. It had been so long since he'd smiled at anything. There had been too many nights spent alone in dimly lit rooms, staring into nothing, chasing the ghosts of his past. But here, in Whitford, he was starting to find a sense of peace he hadn't realized was possible. It was around this time that Jake began to ask Thomas about his life. The old farmer had a way of speaking, of telling stories about his younger years, that made everything seem simple, as if the path to fulfillment was one of honest work and good intentions. Sometimes, in the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the stars blink into the night sky. "How did you get here?" Jake asked one evening as they sat side by side, sipping hot coffee from mismatched mugs. Thomas chuckled softly, his eyes distant for a moment. "Well, I grew up not too far from here. My father had this land, and his father before him. My grandfather was the one who started it all, planting the first orchard on this land, back when it was just a few acres of wild, untamed soil." Jake listened intently, intrigued. "I wasn't born into wealth, Jake, Thomas continued. But I never needed much. I worked for everything I have. Hard work, patience, a little bit of luck. That's what keeps you going in a place like this. Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure if he truly understood what Thomas was saying. He'd never really believed in luck. It had always seemed to him that the rich were lucky, while people like him were just left behind to fight for scraps. And what about you? Thomas asked, turning the question back on Jake. Jake hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know if I'm ready to talk about it, he said quietly. His past, the choices he'd made, were things he wasn't yet ready to share. But in that moment, he realized he had more to offer than just his silence. The work he did on the farm, the time he spent helping Thomas, it felt meaningful. For the first time in years, he was doing something that didn't feel like a waste. In the weeks that followed, Thomas noticed that Jake's eyes were starting to brighten. His shoulders, which had been slumped from so much sorrow, were starting to straighten. Jake still had a long way to go, but the change was there, subtle but undeniable. One particular morning, as the frost still clung to the tips of the grass, Thomas noticed Jake standing by the edge of the property, staring out at the distant hills. There was something in his posture now, something more confident. You all right? Thomas called out from the barn, where he was stacking firewood. Jake turned, a slight smile tugging at his lips. Just thinking about things, he said. About maybe moving on. I've been here for a while. Don't want to overstay my welcome. Thomas paused, considering the young man before him. You're welcome here as long as you need, Jake. But if you're thinking about leaving, then I won't stop you. It's your life. Just remember, no matter where you go, you don't have to do it alone. You've got more strength than you know. Jake nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of something unspoken between them. He wasn't ready to leave yet, not by a long shot. But Thomas's words stayed with him. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future out there for him. A future he hadn't considered until now. The days continued to pass, and as winter began to settle over the land, Jake found himself wrestling with a growing sense of responsibility. He didn't want to let Thomas down. But there was something else. Something that had been stirring within him ever since he had set foot on the farm. It wasn't just the work. It was the fact that Thomas had given him something far more valuable than food or shelter. He had given him hope. He had shown him that even the most broken people could be rebuilt, piece by piece. And Jake realized that maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild himself. It was a few days after this moment of quiet reflection that Jake found himself standing in the small kitchen, staring at a letter that had arrived for him. It was a thick envelope, official-looking, with a return address from a law firm in the city. He hadn't expected anything like this. Not here, not now. He turned the letter over in his hands, a feeling of unease creeping up his spine. Everything all right? Thomas asked, appearing in the doorway. Jake didn't answer immediately, his eyes still fixed on the envelope. Something about it felt important. I don't know, Jake muttered, more to himself than to Thomas. Well, whatever it is, Thomas said with a smile, you don't have to face it alone. Just remember that. Jake nodded slowly, the weight of the letter pressing on his chest. He had no idea what was inside, but one thing was certain. Whatever it was, it would change his life. The evening air in Whitford had a crispness to it as the sun sank low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields. Inside Thomas O'Reilly's farmhouse, the warmth from the fire flickered, illuminating the worn wooden beams overhead. But despite the comfort of the familiar surroundings, Jake Mason couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his gut. He sat at the small kitchen table, the unopened letter lying in front of him like some kind of omen. The envelope was thick, with a return address that had no place in a small town like this. Patterson and Wright, Legal Services, Manhattan. It had arrived that morning, and Jake had spent the rest of the day trying to ignore it. But now, with the evening drawing on and the house quiet, it felt impossible to avoid any longer. Thomas had noticed Jake's sudden distraction. The older man, who had grown accustomed to seeing the younger man in the calm of his daily routines, now saw a hint of tension in Jake's posture. He didn't press, though. He could see Jake was wrestling with something important. You going to open it? Thomas asked gently, from where he stood near the hearth, polishing a brass pot. Jake didn't answer right away, his fingers hovering over the envelope, tracing its edges nervously. The name on the letter was one he didn't recognize. No reason why it should have anything to do with him, right? But something told him that this wasn't just a routine piece of mail. His heart raced a little as he flipped the envelope over, tore it open, and pulled out the letter inside. He unfolded it, the crisp paper almost crackling in his hands as he read, "Dear Mr. Mason, we hope this letter finds you well. We are writing to inform you of an important matter regarding the estate of your late grandfather, Samuel Mason. As the executor of his estate, it is our duty to notify you that you are the sole beneficiary of his assets. These include, but are not limited to, property in New York City, stocks, and various other financial holdings. We understand this news may come as a surprise, and we encourage you to contact us at your earliest convenience to discuss the next steps in claiming your inheritance. Sincerely, Patterson and Wright, Legal Services." Jake's hands went numb as he read and reread the letter. His mind spun wildly as he struggled to process what was written on the paper. Inheritance, property, New York City. It was like something out of a bad dream, too surreal to be true. He had no memory of a grandfather, no recollection of any wealth or property being passed down to him. In fact, the only thing Jake had known about his family's history was a vague mention of a man named Samuel Mason, who had abandoned the family when Jake's father was still a child. Jake's father, Michael, had grown up in foster care, and the few stories Jake had heard over the years painted a picture of a man who had abandoned his family for a life of alcohol and gambling. He had no connection to his grandfather, no memories, no emotional attachment to someone who had walked away from his family. So why was he the beneficiary of a fortune he didn't know existed? He blinked, his breath coming a little more shallow now. He looked up at Thomas, who had stopped what he was doing and was watching Jake closely. Thomas's expression was unreadable, though there was a faint concern in his eyes. "Thomas, this doesn't make sense," Jake muttered, his voice shaky. I don't know what this is about. My grandfather, I don't even know him. Hell, I don't know anything about him." Thomas crossed the room and sat down beside Jake, placing a hand on his shoulder. His touch was firm, reassuring, but gentle. "You're not alone, Jake. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out." Jake stared down at the letter, his thoughts a chaotic swirl. For years, he had lived without anything to his name, scraping by on whatever odd jobs he could find and relying on his broken past to define his future. Now, out of nowhere, came this bizarre and seemingly impossible twist, an inheritance that could change everything. Or maybe it couldn't. Maybe it was all a mistake. But what if it wasn't? He thought about the farm, the simple life he'd been building here with Thomas, the peace he had finally found, and the gradual sense of worth that had come with hard work. The farm had become a sanctuary, a place to breathe and heal. But could he really leave all of that behind? Was he ready to embrace a life of wealth and status, one that seemed to be far removed from the life of struggle he had known? Thomas could sense Jake's inner turmoil. The boy had been through so much already, and this sudden news, whatever it truly meant, was more than a little overwhelming. He didn't know the full story of Jake's past, but he could see the weight of it on him now. "Well," Thomas said after a long pause, "you've got a choice to make. You can stay here. You can keep living the way you've been living, making an honest living on this farm. Or you can go to New York if that's what this letter's about. You don't owe me anything, Jake. You're free to choose." Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. "I've never had anything. And now it feels like everything is changing in a way I don't understand." "Jake," Thomas said, his voice steady but firm, "change is hard. But the question is, what kind of life do you want to live? Do you want the kind of life that you can build with your own hands that feels earned? Or do you want something that comes out of nowhere? Something that might bring more complications than you can handle?" Jake met his gaze. There was a quiet strength in Thomas's words, an unspoken wisdom that only came from years of living an honest life. And for a moment, Jake thought back to the days when he'd felt like everything he did was for nothing. But here, in this small town, with a simple man who had shown him nothing but kindness, Jake had begun to feel something he hadn't thought possible, hope. "I don't know, Thomas," Jake said softly. "I thought I wanted something different. I thought maybe I could leave all this behind and start over. But now, I don't know." "You don't have to decide today, Jake," Thomas replied. "Take your time. Whatever choice you make, just remember, you're not bound by anything except the man you want to be. And that man is someone who has already begun to change." Jake nodded, his fingers still absently tracing the edge of the letter. The decision seemed monumental, the weight of it pressing on him with the kind of urgency he hadn't felt in years. But even as the uncertainty loomed, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone in this moment. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to figure it out all at once. That night, Jake lay awake in the small room in the barn, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. His entire life had led to this point, to this moment of choice. He could walk away from everything he had come to know, everything he had come to love, or he could step into a world he had never dreamed was possible. And as the moonlight filtered through the cracks in the barn's old wooden walls, Jake realized that the choice he made now would shape the rest of his life. The days that followed were filled with restlessness. Jake's mind couldn't settle. Every time he tried to focus on the work around him, on the steady routine that had begun to soothe him over the past few months, his thoughts would wander back to the letter. He hadn't opened it again, not since that night. But it gnawed at him like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The inheritance, the strange twist of fate, it was too big to simply leave behind. But what did it mean for him? Was it a gift or a curse? It was a quiet Thursday morning when Jake finally made his decision. After breakfast, Thomas went out to check on the cattle, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts. The weather was unusually warm for early November, the sun high in the sky and casting long shadows across the field. Jake had been walking through the orchard, his hands in his pockets, when a decision began to crystallize in his mind. He walked to the small, weathered office in the back of the house, where Thomas kept a phone with a direct line to the outside world, because, despite its remoteness, there were always moments when even this isolated farm needed to connect with the world beyond. Jake found the number on the letter, scribbled it down, and dialed. The phone rang for what felt like forever before a voice answered. "Patterson and Wright. How may I assist you?" Yes. My name is Jake Mason. I received a letter from you about an inheritance. I'd like to know more." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "One moment, please," the voice said, and then the sound of muffled footsteps followed. A moment later, the phone was picked up again. "Mr. Mason, this is Robert Grant from Patterson and Wright. I'm glad you called. I'll make sure we provide all the information you need. We were expecting to hear from you." Jake swallowed. He had no idea how this process worked or what to expect. It felt strange to even hear someone talk about him in such formal terms. "I don't understand," Jake said, his voice more cautious now. "How could I have an inheritance? I don't know anything about my grandfather, Samuel Mason. I don't even know where he is or if he's even alive." Another pause on the line. Then Grant's voice, calm and professional, returned. "Mr. Mason, I can assure you that everything is in order. Your grandfather passed away nearly 5 years ago, and in his will, he named you as the sole beneficiary of his estate. As we mentioned in our letter, his assets include properties in New York City, a portfolio of stocks, and several other valuable holdings. The estate is substantial, and it's all yours. Pending your confirmation." Jake felt his chest tighten, his heart pounding. "But I didn't know him. Why would he leave all of this to me? What was his reason for even reaching out after all these years?" Grant hesitated. "I understand your confusion, Mr. Mason. The details of your grandfather's intentions aren't clear, but his will indicates that he hoped you would find this inheritance and use it wisely. He left specific instructions that you would be the one to manage his estate, and that you should be the one to take control of it." Jake's head spun. He had been living in Whitford for months now, trying to put his past behind him, trying to find something meaningful again. And now this, he didn't know if he was prepared for any of it. I need time to think about it," Jake said, his voice shaky. "Of course," Grant replied quickly. "Take all the time you need. We will await your instructions on how you would like to proceed. Our firm is at your disposal, Mr. Mason. Thank you, Jake muttered, still trying to absorb what he'd just heard. Without another word, he hung up the phone. For several minutes, Jake stood there, unmoving, staring out the window at the expanse of farmland stretching before him. The sun was lowering now, casting the land in a soft, amber glow. He had always believed that his future was written in the small, quiet moments. Chasing the next paycheck, fixing the next piece of broken equipment, helping Thomas with whatever needed doing. But now, with the weight of a city's worth of property, stocks, and wealth suddenly in his lap, he felt lost. The thought of New York, of a life he couldn't even begin to imagine, seemed too far removed from the dirt beneath his boots, from the scent of fresh hay in the morning, from the slow rhythm of life on the farm. But the alternative, to stay here, to stay with Thomas, didn't seem like an option anymore, not now that this door had opened. That night, after dinner, Thomas had returned from his rounds, his face creased with fatigue but still as steady as ever. He sat down at the kitchen table, a mug of hot coffee in hand, and looked across the table at Jake, who had been uncharacteristically quiet. "You called them, didn't you?" Thomas asked, his tone light, but with a knowing edge. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, called them. They confirmed everything. There's an inheritance, property in New York City, investments, all sorts of things. It's mine if I want it. If I want to claim it." Thomas didn't immediately respond. He simply took a slow sip from his mug, watching Jake carefully. The two of them sat there for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Finally, Thomas spoke. "And what do you want to do with it?" Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I should just walk away from it. I've worked hard to get away from all that wealth, power, everything that comes with it. I've spent so much of my life just trying to survive, trying to keep my head above water. I don't know if I can handle all that responsibility." Thomas nodded. "It's a big change, Jake. It's a life you can't even imagine yet. But it's your choice. What you've learned here on the farm, that's something money can't buy. You don't need it to feel whole or valuable." Jake looked down at his hands. The dirt and calluses were still there, reminders of the work he'd done over the past few months. But what did that work mean now? Would he leave all of this behind? Would he leave Thomas? "I don't know what I want, Thomas. I'm afraid if I go to New York, I'll lose myself. I'll be just like the people I've always despised, chasing wealth for its own sake, forgetting what really matters. And then I'll be just as empty as I was before." Thomas put his mug down and leaned forward. His voice was soft but certain. "You're not going to lose yourself, Jake. You've already started to find yourself. What matters is not where you are, but who you choose to be. And the choice is yours. You can walk away from it all or you can embrace it. But whatever you decide, you'll still be you." Jake stared into the flickering flames of the hearth, the firelight casting shadows on his face. He had come to this farm a broken man. He had come looking for something he didn't even know he needed. And now, he was faced with a choice that could change everything. Whether he stayed in the quiet of Whitford, or whether he took the leap into the unknown, into a world of wealth and responsibility he had never imagined. The letter had opened a door. But what lay on the other side? And was he ready to walk through it? The days dragged on. It wasn't the quiet of Whitford that Jake longed for anymore, but the certainty of it. He had been through enough change in his life to know that sometimes the only way to truly grow was to step into the unknown. But was he prepared for what lay ahead? He couldn't stay in limbo forever. The letter had been clear. There was an inheritance waiting for him. The estate, the properties, the stocks, the life he never asked for, but perhaps in some strange twist of fate was meant to have. That evening, Jake stood at the kitchen counter, his hand hovering over his phone. He had spent the better part of the afternoon walking around the property, wrestling with his decision. He'd even spoken to Thomas again, who had been unusually quiet this time, offering no counsel except for the simple truth. Whatever you decide, Jake, it's your life. Your future. There was something in those words that kept haunting him. Thomas wasn't offering a way out, and that was what Jake needed. a way out of his own mind, out of the constant battle between fear and ambition. Jake picked up the phone, scrolled to the number on the letter from Patterson and Wright, and dialed. The phone rang for several seconds before the same voice answered. Patterson and Wright. How may I assist you? Hi, Jake said, his voice steady. This is Jake Mason. I'd like to proceed. I want to claim my inheritance. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Mason, we're glad to hear that. We'll begin the process right away. I will arrange a flight for you to New York, and we'll have a meeting scheduled at your earliest convenience. Jake hesitated for a moment. The reality of what he had just said hit him like a wave, but there was no going back now. He had made the decision. It was time to step into a world that felt as foreign to him as the moon. I'll need a little time, he said, his voice slightly more hesitant than he intended. I need to pack, and I'll need some time to prepare myself. I don't know what I'm walking into, and, of course, Mr. Mason, we'll make all the arrangements. We can discuss the details when you arrive in New York. You'll be well taken care of. The phone call ended with the usual pleasantries, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was rushing toward him. A future he wasn't sure he was ready to meet. The next morning, the farm felt different. The air smelled sweeter, like the earth was telling him goodbye. There was a sense of finality to the day, a deep and unspoken understanding between him and the land that had been his home for so long. He packed the last of his things into a small bag, glancing around the farmhouse one final time before locking the door behind him. Thomas was out in the fields again, tending to the animals as he always did. Jake walked up to him, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to say. Words had never been his strength. But somehow he knew this moment had arrived. The unspoken tension between them had grown heavy over the past few days, and now it was time to confront it. Thomas, Jake said, his voice rough with emotion, I'm leaving. I'm going to New York. I don't know what I'm walking into, but it's time I find out. Thomas stopped what he was doing and looked up. The older man's eyes were thoughtful, his weathered face unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Then go, he said, his voice calm and sure. But don't forget where you came from, Jake. And don't forget the man you've become. No city, no amount of money can change that. Stay true to yourself. Jake nodded, his throat tight with unshed emotion. I won't forget, Thomas. Promise. With that, he turned and walked toward the truck that would take him to the airport. As he drove down the winding dirt road, the rolling hills of Whitford disappearing behind him, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. He had found peace in the quiet life, in the simplicity of the farm. But now he was leaving all of that behind, stepping into a world where he didn't know the rules, where he didn't know the people. He had made his choice, but was it the right one? New York City. The very name sent shivers down Jake's spine. He had seen it in movies, on TV, but had never imagined that he would step foot in it. The sprawling metropolis, a jungle of concrete and glass, where millions of people bustled in every direction, each of them driven by their own ambition. The contrast with Whitford could not have been more stark. The plane landed at John F. Kennedy International Airport, and Jake stepped off, his stomach a knot of nerves. He had never traveled this far, never seen the world beyond the small towns of the Midwest. Now, as he stood in the terminal, trying to orient himself in the sea of people, he felt a profound sense of smallness. The city was alive with energy, but it felt like an alien world. A black car was waiting for him, the driver holding a sign with his name written on it. Jake climbed in, his bag at his side, unsure of what awaited him. The ride to the city was a blur. The streets seemed to stretch on forever, the buildings towering above him like silent giants. The lights, the sounds, the constant rush. It was all so overwhelming. But amid the chaos, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was where he was supposed to be. The car finally came to a stop in front of a high-rise building, one of those sleek, glass and steel towers that seemed to define New York. The doorman opened the door for him, and Jake stepped out onto the sidewalk, feeling the cold bite of the city air. Inside, the lobby was luxurious. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the faint scent of fresh flowers. A receptionist greeted him with a smile, and after a brief exchange, Jake was escorted to a private elevator. The elevator ascended quickly, the sound of the music in the background almost drowned out by the hum of the machinery. When the doors opened, he was led down a long corridor to a set of double doors, which the assistant opened with a smile. "Mr. Mason," the assistant said, stepping aside. "Mr. Robert Grant is expecting you." Jake stepped inside, his heart thumping in his chest. And there, sitting behind a large, imposing desk, was the man he had spoken to on the phone just days earlier. Robert Grant was as sharp and polished as the building itself. Well-dressed, well-groomed, and every inch the professional. He stood up and extended his hand to Jake. "Mr. Mason, it's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Welcome to New York." Jake shook his hand, feeling the weight of what he had just walked into. He had crossed a threshold that would forever change the course of his life. Grant gestured to the sleek chairs across from him. "Please have a seat. Let's talk about your grandfather's estate. There's a lot to discuss." And as Jake sat down, the reality of his situation began to sink in. The simple farm life he had known was now a distant memory. This was the beginning of something far bigger, something he couldn't possibly have prepared for. The doors closed behind Jake with a soft click, sealing him into the sleek, glass-walled office of Robert Grant, the lawyer who had been handling his grandfather's estate. The view from the 38th floor was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. Below, the sprawling chaos of New York City hummed with a life of its own. Cabs honking, crowds rushing, the incessant rhythm of a metropolis that never paused. But inside, the atmosphere was cool, controlled. The sort of world Jake could never have imagined, let alone navigated, back in Whitford. "Please have a seat, Mr. Mason," Robert Grant said, his voice smooth, almost too practiced. He gestured to one of the chairs in front of the large desk, his movements deliberate, confident. Jake sat down slowly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The room was silent for a moment, save for the hum of the city below, and Grant's sharp eyes studied him with an intensity that made Jake uncomfortable. "Now," Grant said, breaking the silence, "let's get down to business. Your grandfather, Samuel Mason, was not just a wealthy man. He was a man of power, and with that power came responsibilities. A responsibility, Mr. Mason, that has now fallen on you." Jake nodded, unsure how to respond. He had been half expecting this conversation, yet the words still hit him like a cold splash of water. The weight of the inheritance had been dawning on him slowly, but now, in this high-rise office, in this world of polished suits and glass towers, it felt too real, too overwhelming. "You have inherited more than just property, Mr. Mason," Grant continued, his tone shifting slightly, taking on a more businesslike edge. "You've inherited a legacy. Your grandfather's holdings span across several sectors: real estate, tech investments, a luxury brand, even a private equity firm. But the centerpiece of his empire, the jewel in the crown, is the Mason Group, a conglomerate that controls a vast array of assets." Jake leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "The Mason Group?" he repeated, trying to make sense of the words. He had never heard of it. Not once in his life had he been exposed to anything like it. The farm, the quiet life, that had always been his world. How could he have inherited something so large, so intricate? "Yes, the Mason Group," Grant said. He seemed to sense Jake's confusion, his voice becoming more patient now, though still wrapped in the silk of professionalism. "The company controls over $5 billion in assets, with investments in tech startups, real estate developments in Europe and Asia, and some high-profile ventures in the entertainment industry. It's a powerful company, one that could change your life. But it's also a responsibility, a burden in some ways." Jake felt the weight of those words sink in, but the details seemed like a blur. All he could think about was the simple, peaceful life he had left behind in Whitford. "But," Jake began, his voice unsure, "why me? Why didn't he leave this to someone else? Someone who knew how to handle all this?" Grant paused, his expression unreadable. "Your grandfather's reasons are his own. But I can tell you this: Samuel Mason was not a man to act on whim. He chose you for a reason, Mr. Mason. He believed that you had something in you, something no one else did. His will states that you are to take control of the Mason Group and continue its legacy. And if you don't, the assets will be liquidated, and the company will cease to exist. Your decision is critical. Jake's head spun. This wasn't what he had expected. He had assumed the inheritance would be something tangible, something he could hold in his hands, real estate, a few stocks, maybe. But this was more than just money. This was power. And power came with a price. Grant opened a folder on his desk and slid a few papers across to Jake. This is a comprehensive overview of the Mason Group, its holdings, and your responsibilities as the new CEO. These documents outline your options and the decisions you will need to make in the coming days. I recommend you take your time reviewing them. Jake picked up the papers, but the words blurred in front of him. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't prepared to be the CEO of some massive corporation. The weight of it felt like a straitjacket tightening around his chest. He wanted to run. He wanted to pick up the phone and tell Grant that he was walking away, that he had no interest in this empire. But he couldn't. Not yet. You must understand, Grant continued, his tone more insistent now, that the world you've stepped into is not one of small decisions. Every choice you make will have consequences. There are people who will want your attention, your approval, and your influence. And there are those who will want to undermine you, to take what your grandfather built and use it for their own gain. This is a game, Mr. Mason, and you must decide whether you will play it. Jake swallowed, trying to steady his breath. His palms were clammy, and his mind raced. His life had been simple once, a life where every day had been about survival and hard work, where every step forward had been earned with sweat. Now everything felt like a game of chance, and he was standing at the center of it, blindfolded. Grant continued, his voice lowering slightly. I know this is a lot to absorb, but think carefully. There are those who will help you, and those who will hinder you. And there is one thing you must understand above all else: this world runs on power. It runs on influence, and it runs on loyalty. Without these, your inheritance will slip through your fingers before you even know it. Jake's throat tightened. The words were clear, sharp, like knives cutting through his uncertainty. This wasn't just about money. This was about power. And power, as he had learned over the past few days, was something that could destroy a man just as easily as it could make him. You've given me a lot to think about, Jake said, his voice hoarse, though he was still trying to process it all. He wasn't sure if he was ready to shoulder this burden, but there was no turning back. Not now. Grant leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of him. Take your time, Mr. Mason, but understand this: every day you hesitate is a day someone else is taking your place. The choice is yours. With that, the meeting ended. Jake stood, feeling the full weight of the decision ahead of him pressing down on his chest. He walked out of the office, the sleek glass doors closing behind him, and for a moment, stood in the lobby of the building, trying to steady his breath. The weight of his grandfather's empire was now his to carry, and the price of power was a price he wasn't sure he was willing to pay. The night after the meeting with Robert Grant, Jake barely slept. He tossed and turned, the relentless buzzing of the city far below mixing with his thoughts, amplifying his confusion. It was as if the entire world had suddenly changed overnight, and now, standing on the edge of this towering empire, he had to decide whether to jump in or turn back. At first light, Jake stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, the weight of the world pressing against his chest. He could see the sun rising over the horizon, casting an orange glow across the East River, but it did little to calm his nerves. The luxury apartment, a temporary place he'd been assigned, felt as alien to him as the city itself. The entire building had the smell of polished glass, money, and ambition. And while it was beautiful, it felt like a cage. Jake had always known what was expected of him back in Whitford: hard work, honesty, loyalty to his family and land. But here, in this world of corporate jets, designer suits, and glossy brochures, he felt like a child playing in a grown-up's game. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Grant. Mr. Mason, I trust you're reviewing the documents. I'll be in touch to discuss next steps. Please let me know if you need anything. Jake's thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, but he didn't respond. There was no more time for delays. His mind, exhausted from the decisions, raced back to that simple moment in Whitford, the day his grandfather had passed away, and the letter that had arrived at the farm a few weeks later. That $30 his grandfather had given him on a hungover morning now seemed more significant than ever. Was it fate? Was it a warning? Or was it just the beginning of a legacy that had already taken root in his life? The next day, Jake met with Grant again, though this time, they were joined by a small group of professionals. Accountants, financial analysts, and a PR team, all neatly dressed and sharply focused. There was something about the cold efficiency of the meeting that unsettled Jake further. Everything was measured, calculated, planned. He was being packaged, his life dissected into charts, projections, and quarterly earnings. Mr. Mason, one of the accountants, a woman with sharp glasses and a businesslike tone, began, "Your grandfather left specific instructions for the operation of Mason Group. The assets are significant, but there are areas that need immediate attention." Jake had barely understood half of what she had said. Stocks, bonds, mergers, and acquisitions, it was like they were speaking a different language. "Your grandfather's portfolio has some risks," she continued, "but also a great deal of potential. The luxury real estate division, in particular, is primed for development in several international markets. With a strategic approach, we could easily double the value of the assets in under 5 years. Jake didn't answer. He stared at the projection slides on the screen, his mind already tired. "I can't do this," Jake muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone in the room. Grant's eyes snapped up to meet his, the calm, collected lawyer suddenly leaning in. "What do you mean by that, Mr. Mason?" Jake felt his chest tighten, a flush of heat rising to his face. He could feel the eyes of the team on him. He wasn't ready for this. Not just the business, but the weight of it. The deceit and manipulation that Grant wasn't even hiding anymore. He wasn't sure if it was just the corporate world that felt so foreign to him, or if it was the people who were far too eager to turn his grandfather's legacy into just another business transaction. "I didn't ask for this," Jake finally said, his voice hoarse, but strong. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't want to inherit an empire, and I sure as hell didn't ask for someone to tell me how to run it." Grant's smile was tight, almost patronizing. "Mr. Mason," he said slowly, "nobody gets to choose their inheritance. But you have a responsibility, and not just to yourself. You're standing on the precipice of something that could change your life and the lives of many others. This is your chance to make an impact on the world, to be remembered, not as a farmer's son, but as the man who took control of the Mason Group and carried on his grandfather's legacy." Jake's mind raced. He wanted to shout at Grant, tell him that all the money and influence in the world couldn't replace the life he had known, the sense of purpose, the connection to the earth, the people who had relied on him. But that wasn't the world he was in now. This was a world where his choices mattered far more than anything he'd known before. And the moment he stepped into it, there would be no turning back. "What about the other part?" Jake finally asked, his voice quiet but firm. "The part about loyalty, power, and trust?" Grant seemed to freeze for a moment, then smiled that practiced smile again. "Yes, Mr. Mason, that is part of it. Power, loyalty, trust, they are all commodities in this world. People will come to you with their hands out, but you must decide who is worthy of your trust. And you must always be wary of those who will betray you." Jake knew then that the world Grant had described wasn't just a corporate machine. It was a world of games, of manipulation and alliances, a world where loyalty was bought and sold like a commodity. And Jake wasn't sure he had the stomach for it. Later that afternoon, Jake found himself walking along the edge of the Hudson River, trying to clear his mind. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water. He had never seen anything so beautiful. And yet, in the back of his mind, a question gnawed at him. Was it worth it? He thought of the farm, the land, the animals, the peaceful, simple life that had been his father's and his grandfather's before him. And then he thought of the city of power, wealth, and greed. Jake stopped by a bench overlooking the river and sat down, the weight of the decision threatening to crush him. "Jake?" The voice cut through his thoughts. He turned to see Thomas, the old farmhand from Whitford, standing at the edge of the park. Thomas had followed him to the city. "What are you doing here?" Jake asked, standing up, his eyes wide with surprise. "Came to see how you were holding up," Thomas said simply, stepping forward. He sat down next to Jake, his old, weathered face full of concern. Jake was at a loss for words. He had been prepared to face this decision alone. But now, with Thomas beside him, everything felt different. Somehow, just his presence, his quiet reassurance, made the weight of the world feel a little lighter. "Thomas, I don't know what to do," Jake admitted, his voice breaking. "I feel like I'm about to lose myself in all of this. I don't want the power. I don't want the money. I just want to be the man I was. The man who walked the land, who knew what mattered." Thomas put a hand on Jake's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "Jake, you've got it wrong. The money, the power, it doesn't have to change who you are. It just gives you more room to make choices. And the thing about power is it can be used for good as much as for bad. But you've always had power, Jake. You've always had the power to choose. Don't let anyone tell you that it has to be any different now." Jake nodded slowly, the weight on his chest easing. Maybe Thomas was right. The world around him had changed, but he didn't have to change with it. The choice was his, the power was his, and it was time to take it. With a deep breath, Jake stood up, looking out over the river one last time. He knew now what he had to do. The story of Jake Mason, the humble farmer who inherited an empire, had come to its turning point. In the end, the question wasn't about wealth or power, it was about who Jake chose to be. Would he become the man who ruled a corporate kingdom, or the man who stayed true to his roots, using his newfound influence for something greater than himself? Only time would tell.